Alright, so in this video I'm going to explain the concept of combination selectors and then show you a couple use cases and then how to differentiate them. Alright, so before we start with that, let's make sure we understand the layout of this specific page. So this is some internal CSS, so that's defining our styling. That's what we're going to work with, so we're just going to ignore that for now. Again, that's just in the head tag there with the meta and title tag and whatnot. In the body, we have a couple different objects. So we have a div, and that div holds two paragraphs, and then another div which contains another paragraph. And then we have a paragraph that's out here on its own. And then we have another div that contains three paragraphs, but it doesn't, and no like sub divs inside of it. So effectively we have a page with a div with some paragraphs and a sub div with a paragraph in it, a paragraph outside of a div, and then another div with three paragraphs. Okay, so I have a couple different selectors here. I have .para-div, and that's dot, so that means that this is a class selector as opposed to an ID selector or an element selector. We have a body, which is an element selector, so that applies to the whole body. So I set the font size to 21 point, and the background color to dim gray, and that applies again to the entire body unless it's superseded, which it is in this case with the div. So this first div is assigned to the class para-div, and that is set to a background color of royal blue since it's a class and that's more specific than the element tag. Then that takes precedence, so that's why this is blue and it's no longer dim gray. Note that there's no class or ID selector applied to the second div, so that's not taken on. And then we have this combination selector, and that's what we're going to play with. So I'm going to start off by setting this just to P. Alright, to div. So this is what's known as a descendant selector. So for all descendants of a specific element, it's going to do something. So in this case, it sets this is just for the div descendants. It's going to make the background color smoke white and the border solid 3-point and black. So that applies just to the div element there, which is a descendant or a child of the .para-div div. Okay, so let's change this to P now instead of div. So now it's applying the styling to all of the P tags within the para-div. So again, this is still a descendant selector, but instead of just applying to the div element, it's applying to each of the paragraph elements. Remember that this third paragraph is inside of a div, which is inside of our current div, which is assigned to the para-div class. So it's still being impacted by this selector because it's still a descendant of it, because it's within the para-div div. So that basically applies to all the descendants of any specific of class in this case. All right, so now I'm going to change this to a child selector, and the difference here is that this is only going to apply to the immediate children of that element. So to specify that, we use the greater than sign, and then we set this to whatever we want to select. So in this case, we're going to do P. Okay, so this again is a child selector. So note that this styling was applied to the first two paragraphs, but not to the last paragraph. And that's because the child selector, by definition, only applies to immediate children. And this last paragraph is not an immediate child of this div because it's contained within another div. So effectively, this is like a grandchild as opposed to an immediate child. So again, that's the difference between using the child selector, which applies just to the immediate children, versus using the descendant selector, which applies to all of its descendants. Okay, so now we're going to look at an adjacent sibling selector. So this is done with the plus sign. So I'm going to put a plus here. Okay, so now we're applying this style not to any immediate children or all descendants, but specifically to the adjacent sibling. So anything that's a sibling of this div that has the class div class assigned to it and also is a paragraph because it's only for paragraphs. So remember, if we look back at our structure, we have a div, another div, and then a paragraph embedded between them. So this div, this paragraph, and this div are all at the same level. So they're siblings. So this is applying it to its adjacent sibling, which is this paragraph element. Okay, and then the last one here is known as a general sibling selector, which will apply this to all of its siblings. So this really didn't change anything because we only have one paragraph. So what I'm going to do is make a second paragraph here. And note that that styling is now applied to that second paragraph, even though it's not adjacent to this div. And that's because this is a general sibling selector that applies to all of the siblings of this div, which is in the paradiv class, that are, again, at the same level. If I swap this back to an adjacent sibling selector with the plus sign, then it would just impact this paragraph because this second paragraph is no longer adjacent to it. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to the combination selectors, which can be useful for picking out specific elements relative to other elements that you want to apply some type of style to.